We're going to start with you giving your name and your age, if you don't mind.
My name is Sara Grace Owen. I'm 95 years old. I was born October the 11th, 1915, at the residence of my maternal grandparents, David and Sara Adele Ames, on South Toledo Street, presently the residence of Joyce and Eugene Contock. My parents were Edith A. and Glenn C. Wood. I had two older brothers, John H. and Kenneth A.
Okay, and so that obviously puts you growing up in Elmore. How about if we start with maybe the schools? Do you have any stories about the schools at that time?
When I was 4, we moved into my present home at 258 Rice Street. And we walked to school, which was at the corner of Maple and Fremont Street, which would be across from the present ice cream on the left. And we were there till the 5th grade when we moved into the new school building, presently located at
105? Or 20?
Fremont and...
Oh, you went to that school, sorry. State, not state. Well, we know where it is.
Augusta.
Is that
5th or 4th, isn't it? Street?
I'm not
Augusta
sure.
Street. Fremont and Augusta. At that time, there were 2 grades in one room. First grade teacher was Miss Reese, and we had her in the 1st and 2nd grade, and then the 3rd and 4th grade was Esker Gonski Kuhlman. And then in the 5th grade in the new school, we had Mabel Rosine. And at that time, the school was centralized and the country schools were closed, and the kids came in to our school. And the 6th grade was Daisy Wainwright, and she ruled with an iron hand. She had a ruler, and if you misbehave, you got it. And my mother had gone to Europe, and she brought me a 2-piece suit, knit suit from Belgium. And I didn't get the ruler, but I about got shook out of my top. That news went home to my mother before I got home at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The 7th grade was Bernice Contock, and the 8th grade was Dora Kuhlman. And high school, we had different teachers for the various subjects. I remember Marie Schlesman was one of the teachers, and we always were interested in what she was going to be wearing. She was a very classy dresser. And Miss Deschler, Bill Everhart, and he married one of my classmates, Jeanette Niss. George Green was the superintendent, and he was not married at the time, and he rented a room about 4 doors from where I lived. And so on the nights of the basketball games out of town, he'd take a group of us, 6 in the back seat and 3 with him in the front seat. And of course it was boys and girls. And every once in a while he'd flash his flashlight in the back and want to know how everybody was doing. And when we came home from the game, he would let the boys out downtown, but he saw to it that each of the girls was dropped off at her home. And later Mr. Green married, and had one son. His wife was had also been a teacher, and
Well, were you involved in any music or sports or anything? Journalism, anything in school? Nothing strikes you, huh? Does any teacher stand out? Did you have a favorite teacher?
I think my favorite teacher would have been Bernice Contock, Bernice Buck Contock, and that was in the 7th grade. And but they were all nice. There was only one in high school that I found myself standing out in the hall most of the time. He would always call me Grace, and I wouldn't answer because that wasn't my name. My name was Sara Grace, and I expected to be called that. And there was a Grace in our class, Grace Damschroeder.
Well, that makes sense to me.
Let's see. We didn't have television, thank goodness, and we didn't have computers. So we spent a lot of our time playing outside after school and after supper. And we played Run Sheepy Run and Red Light and all those games. And then we'd sit under the street light and tell stories. And there were a lot of kids in the neighborhood. And we somehow knew when it was time to go home and wait for the next day. And we walked to school, even though it was from one side of town to the other. We didn't have cars. And now the kids have to be driven to school and picked up, and we didn't know what that was.
Would you mind mentioning some of your friends?
In the 7th grade, Evelyn Druckenmauer moved to town. Her father had died. They lived in a farm in Lindsay, and she moved across the street, and she was always a very dear friend. She died a few years ago of lupus, and she also became a school teacher. And Elfrida Barnes, Esther Bothy, Esther Damschroeder, Elsie Kredetsky, Norman Damschroeder, he married Evelyn. Gene Watson, his father had a barbershop downtown. His mother had died when he was young. Walter Hall, Walter died in service. His sister Adelaide was a good friend of mine for many years. She was younger, but Helen Hurlbrink and her sister Ruth, and they lived just behind us. Ruth was alone. Helen was alone when Ruth was born before it was time to go to school. And Helen was so shook up that she didn't even tell when she got to school that she had a baby sister. We learned that afterwards. I guess today it would be no big deal, but it was then.
Well, you mentioned the barbershop. Why don't you tell us what you remember of the businesses? Because you've gone through lots of changes in the businesses, and that's one of the things that people seem to be interested in, is what was in the buildings.
Mm-hmm. Which side of the street you want to start
I
on?
don't care. You start where you like.
Behind which is now Huntington Bank, was a residence. When I was a child, Dr. Drumgold lived there, and he had a little building that was his office. And if I'm not mistaken, that building was moved to Lauren and Annette Troutman's. And down the hill, on the left-hand side, was Laurie Doff's gas station. And on the other side of the street was a residence and an elderly couple lived there by the name of Vilhauer. At the top of the hill where the flower shop just closed, I remember the first thing was a tire shop there, and the building was entirely different. It was raised up quite a ways from the ground, and later it was a movie, and Elmore had a theater. And across the street, where next to the Huntington Bank was Mrs. Guthrie's ice cream parlor, and you could get a tin roof for a dime. And there was a barber shop, and that remained a barber shop for a good many years. It's now Brandau's Insurance, and where the Portage Inn is, that was Henry House's department dry goods store, and he also had groceries and a truck that he went around the country and sold to the housewives. And then there was a second barber shop, and that was Donald Waters. And then there was the Welcome Inn, and that was owned by Norman Damschure's father. And next to that was the Opera House, and it had slanted floor for the seats, and then there was a basketball court and a stage. And next to that, at one time, was a post office, and if I remember correctly, Carl Whitty was the postmaster. And Jaggers had a hardware in there, which is now the Mantique shop, and it was the telephone office where the beauty parlor is, and Peterson's garage was on the corner. Across the street was the Elmore Produce, and that was Otto Rosine, Mabel's husband, and he sold chickens and eggs and cream. I remember I always had to go down to get sour cream for Mom's baking, and there was always a cat in the window, and that went on for years and years. My children are now 71 and 2, and they still remember watching the cat. And then there was the post office, moved across into the new building that George Wise built, and it was a millinery store, and that was later Helen St. John's beauty parlor. There was Whitinger's grocery store, and across the alley was the fire station, and Wise's harness shop, which was later Myers and Sobrowski, and that was, they were funeral directors, but the funeral home was where Sobrowski's lived across from the fire station, the present fire station. The drugstore has been there as long as I can remember. Gering's had it before Ed Truman, and now the present owners, and where the Pendleton antique store was George Wise's shoe store, and Tank's Meat Market, and Berman's furniture store, and Hartman's restaurant, where the Village Inn is, and the Elmore Hardware, which had moved from where the Food Doctors were, and later Mr. Tash's second-hand store, and was Al Gossman's tailor shop, and Wise's grocery store on the corner. And Ed Bothy and Clara Wise were clerks in there. I've left out a few, I know, but
Well, I know around the corner was the plumbing store, correct?
yes,
Yeah.
Reynolds Plumbing
Yes.
Store was around the corner. And then Brandis and Troutman built the Food Locker building. And I might say that's where our first library was.
Okay.
The library started in my dining room. The Federation of Women's Clubs solicited the town for books, and there were probably 6 or 7 gals that would come when they had time and catalog the books in my dining room where they were stacked. It was Kate Slates and Helen Wendt, Jen Rader, Betty Gearing, Gertrude Wise. They came whenever they had time and typed. But in 1945, my husband was due to return from the war in Europe, and I said, "You gotta get the books out of here." So Mr. Troutman said that we could use the right-hand end of the store, and we put shelves in there, and that was the first library. And then we moved from there to what is now Kent Wise's office, and then the new building was built, and there was been an addition to that. So I think we can be very proud of our library,
Yeah.
and especially the history department. People come from all over to get information. My
And of
junior
course,
year of
yeah.
high school, I went to Dallas, Texas, and attended the Hockaday School for Girls. My father's mother lived across the street, so I was not a boarding student. I was a day student. I still keep in touch with one of the girls, but I've long forgotten the rest of them. But the nice thing about the school was not especially the academic courses, but the boys' school. Terrell Boys' School was 2 blocks away, and that was new to me, that when you had any social event, you invited the boys. And, so, of course, their football team is in demand as dates, and it was a wonderful experience, but I prefer Little Elmore.
And what did you study there?
Just general high school.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. All right. I wasn't sure.
No, it wasn't.
If it was a
No.
college level
No.
or okay. Well,
I
that's-
graduated from Hockaday in 1933. My brothers graduated from Culver Military in 1928. My father had graduated from there in about 1902, perhaps. After graduation, in February, I enrolled in St. Vincent's Hospital School of Nursing. Graduated in 1937. I worked at several of the hospitals in Toledo, and by that time my brother Kenneth was in medical school in Detroit and driving ambulance for one of the city hospitals. So he said they needed nurses. You can't believe this, but anyway, St. Vincent's was paying $2 a day at the time I graduated, and that was for a 12-hour day. So I went to Michigan to work, and they paid $90 a month plus board and room, and I really thought that I had it made. I bought a fur coat first thing, and still have it. People don't wear fur coats anymore.
Did you work locally at all?
Then I came back to Toledo, and I worked at Robinwood. That is now St. Luke's, but it was on Robinwood Avenue, and I worked there during the war. And then after my husband came home, I didn't work until St. Charles was built.
Okay.
And then I had the newborn nursery at St. Charles. And one of my little preemies that weighed just over 2 pounds is now a retired school teacher and has 2 daughters of her own, and we still keep in touch. And, but then from there, I was employed by Dr. Ridenour, and after he started practice in Elmore above, well, it was a post office at that time, but now I don't think there's anything in there now. It was an antique store, but I think it's empty now. And we didn't think anything of it being upstairs, and people climb the stairs regardless. And they built the new office. Dr. Kiefer had come in with him a year later, and the new office was in 1961. And I worked in the office until 1983. And my husband died in 85, and I haven't worked since that time. But now I'm just a patient of the office.
Before you trained as a nurse, did you work in any of the buildings locally? Did you work for any of the
No,
local businesses?
no.
Okay.
I wanted to work at the basket factory, but my father, all the other girls in high school did, but my father wouldn't let me work there, so.
Well, do you remember anything specific about some of the events that would happen in town, parades or homecomings?
I don't really remember when the homecoming parade started, but I know they were a lot more extravagant than they are now, and people built floats and it was really a nice parade. I had a brown Cub Scout troop for a while, and I have 3 children. My daughter is 72, and she chose not to go to college. She worked for Boswick Brown at the time, and then for years worked for the warehouse at Ace Hardware as traffic manager, and she retired from there a few years ago. My older son is 71, and he is a graduate of General Motors Institute and was an engineer with General Motors, retired at an early age. He was given credit for his 5 years at college, so he was able to retire at 48. And he's presently living in Utica, Michigan. My younger son graduated from the University of Hawaii, and he said he was the only campus that had orchids to walk on. And we had the good fortune to visit him twice, once in winter in graduation, and it's much nicer to go in the wintertime. And he majored in banking and finance, but said he soon learned that there was no money in banking unless you owned the bank. So he took the finance end of it and was in Chicago for years with Deloitte and Touche, and retired to Sacramento, California. His wife was originally from California. They have 1 daughter, Gabrielle, who is married and lives in Chicago. And yesterday, Flag Day, their baby celebrated her first birthday.
Oh.
And Grandma had flown in for the occasion. She's probably freezing to death.
Well, let's see. How about some interesting people in Elmore? People that, I don't care what kind of story you want to tell, just some of the general population, business keepers or neighbors. You got any stories about people?
Well, our backdoor neighbor for years was their Hobrings. I mentioned Helen and Ruth, and their mother was Tilly, and if she whispered, you could hear her. And when she called the girls, I'm sure they could hear on the other end of town, and her husband worked at the elevator, and when he'd come home for lunch, he'd say, "Well, did you find the girls? I heard you calling." And Haynes lived across from the Church of God, and they had one daughter who married Russell Vining, and they built a new home on the opposite side of the street at the other end. And Russell worked for one of the glass companies in Toledo, and I don't think that his wife ever worked. And Mr. Haynes was a pharmacist that worked in a Toledo pharmacy, and their son Robert worked for a Ford Motor Company in Detroit, came home weekends. The house next to them, the Gossmans, Mr. Gossmans, as I mentioned, was the tailor downtown, and he was a bachelor, and he had two sisters. One had been married, but the other had not, and the one sister kept house, and the other sister worked for him in the tailor shop. I said he was a bachelor, but when I worked at St. Luke's, Robinwood, they had 8-bed wards at that time, and I was very surprised one afternoon when Mr. Gossman appeared with a bouquet of flowers for one of the patients in the 8-bed ward. And I later learned that was a girlfriend that he had had for years, which I don't think anybody knew anything about. And I would have known either if I hadn't worked at the hospital. And across the street on the corner was the Whitingers that had the grocery store. And next to them, Bill Damshoter, the barber, built a new home. And Howard and Margaret Coben bought the lot next to them and built a new home. And the next was Ed Whiteman, who was a bachelor, and he always had the latest in cars. And the next house was a dressmaker, Russell Vining's mother. And our home, from the kitchen to the hall, the upstairs Sara was in, and that makes a narrow place there. And Mrs. Vining couldn't get through there. She had to go around through the living room.
Oh my.
So I always say, that's a measure. When you can't get down the hall, it's time to die.
Yeah.
Julius Damshoter built the next house, and he was a butcher. And then the house that burned was Grandma Miller's, and on the corner across from the Crescent Lake Fire Station was Mr. Wise that owned the store downtown, the Wise Harness. Across the street in the big brick house, which is now his apartment, was where Willie's lived, and Claude was a little older than I am. And then next to him, way back on the lot, was a single man, Mr. Sauerwein. And the next house was where Damshoters that had the dry goods store lived. And before them was the Hartliebs, probably one of the very few families that lived in poverty. And Folkerts lived in the next house. They had a son that was my brother's age, and the next was a vacant lot, and that's where we used to play. There was a mound there that originally had cannas, but they had been taken out, and we had all kinds of games that we could use that mound for different things. And later, Mr. Gossman built a new home there. The next house was Richard's, and they had 2 boys. Scott was a little older than I, and John was a little younger. And the next house was Aldrich, and that later became a duplex, and there were many people in and out of both the top and the bottom. And Mary and Art Flick finally bought it and lived there for years. And on the corner was the Sowers, and Mrs. Sowers was a widow, and her son Rudolph lived behind Whitinger's, and he worked in the grocery store. So,
Well, I like that. That was a good description of the neighborhood. I like that. Go ahead.
people were a lot more friendly then, and there was more togetherness. I hate to admit, but I hardly know my neighbors now, and don't even know the names of the people that live in some of the places across the street or down at the other end of the block. And I think it's pretty much that way all over. And there was a time when you knew everybody in town, and my older son was a paper boy, and he still remembers where everybody lived. And now I haven't walked downtown probably for a year, but when I did, everyone was strangers. You didn't know whether they were just passing through town or whether they lived someplace. You just don't know people.
Sure.
And it was a time when you knew everybody.
Well, we have about one more thing for you to think about. Do you have any stories about how weather affected your life, like maybe the blizzards of '78 or some other?
Weather didn't make much difference. In the wintertime, we coasted. The boys would pull us on our sleds, and we'd go out this side of Shadell's. There weren't any houses in there. We coasted on that hill, or we went across the river about where Dr. Kiefer lives, and we'd go down that hill, and where the apartment is on the left-hand side of East Rice Street, about at the monument. And we used to coast down that hill, but the lady across the street didn't particularly like kids, so she'd throw her ashes on the hill so we couldn't coast. But it didn't make any difference how cold it was, we were out. And same way in the summertime, the girls would get together on somebody's front porch, and we'd embroider. You could buy blocks down at Mrs. Damschroeder's for $10, I think it was, and you embroider them in turkey red thread. In fact, I had enough blocks that in later years my mother put it together and had it quilted. And but I don't. My daughter has it, but I don't think it's ever been used. It was never too hot, never too cold.
Wow. Did you use the river at all for recreation?
Well, we weren't supposed to. But,
That's the way it always is.
we weren't supposed to be at the river, but I have to admit we were sometimes. And now my older son tells me stories of what they used to do down at the river, especially on the railroad bridge. And I shudder to think of it, but I didn't know it then, so it was all right. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago when they were home, he drove down to a spot where you could see the railroad bridge, and he was explaining to me as well as to his wife how they used to jump down on the cement structure, and when the trains were coming, and then they'd climb along the framework, and I shudder to think of it, and I'm glad I didn't know it at that time. But the river was always pretty shallow, and so.
Well, that was one of the things that I had wondered, if the river was pretty much the same now,
Yes.
or if it, okay.
Yes, it used to come up into, I think the lady's name is Hoffman that lives there. It's across from the old church. She has a studio there and when Gary's that had the drugstore lived in that house, they had a garden, flower garden, terraced and way down to the river, and the river used to come up into their yard and spoil their flowers, and it still does. It was just recently that high, but at Woodville, I think the kids could boat and that, but we couldn't in ours. You could walk across on the stones. Or
Sure.
So.
Sure.
Speaking of the river, I think it was about 1925 when the bridge was built, and I had gotten a new matching scarf and tam for Christmas. And we went down, I had that on, and we went down to the river to hang over the railing to watch the ice and that. And the wind blew my hat, my tam into the water, and I don't think to her dying day that my mother ever knew what happened to that hat. But we couldn't ice skate on the river or anything like that. I think the boys used to swim out at a quarry where the turnpike, across from where the turnpike maintenance building is.
I didn't realize there was a quarry over there. That's all the questions we have. But if there's something else that you have been thinking of as you've been going along. That's fine. I'm delighted at what you've had to say. Some of the things that we've not heard, so I'm really glad that you came in to help us out. Thank you. Just go ahead. Tell the story.
When I was still living at my grandmother's, during the First World War with the flu epidemic, I had flu, and my brother Ken told me just maybe a couple years ago, I had never known, that he said that they were afraid that I was going to die, and I guess I was really sick, and he said that was when he made up his mind he was going to be a doctor. Ken was 4 years older than I am, so he must have just been 7, 8 years old. And my grandfather worked at a mill which was along the tracks, and he told the engineers that I was in the bed in the living room by that window, so they would always blow their whistle and wave.
Oh,
And I remember that,
yeah.
but that's about the only thing I remember that.
Do you remember, because in studying my own family, I know we lost a lot of kids, especially, it seemed like young people. Do you remember it being hard on the village?
Yeah.
Was there a lot of sickness in the village?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There was a lot of flu.
Yeah. Yeah.